MEMRI recently completed its 20th year of struggle, of hard work, as we pursue our mission to share a greater knowledge of the Middle East and the reality of the Middle East to the Western, especially audiences in Washington, D.C., but around the West. We seek to communicate the truth, and to do that, we rely on basic sources, on what the media of the region says, what is said by imams in mosques, and what is written in textbooks. And what we saw and what we faithfully communicated through those now 21 years is an often bitter reality. A Middle East which had, despite all its faults and violence, still been at times something of a refuge for ethnic and religious groups, for Jews fleeing persecution in Spain, and for Christians who had suffered under the persecutions of the imperial church based in Constantinople, has deteriorated. The past of the region cannot be romanticized, and intolerance, persecution, and violence existed within that world from the beginning, from the time of the Beni Qurayza in Medina. But the deeply ingrained pre-modern bigotry of the past has more recently been fused with the terrifying efficiency of the nation-state and the speed and power of technology. The hope that existed that the lands ruled by the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century would evolve as the West did, even if slowly and painfully, but still steadily in that direction, has been dashed. So we see the region become a renewed source of persecution and intolerance for its non-Muslim communities. From its earliest years, MEMRI has cared for and reported in detail on the Christians of the Middle East, on their reality and their tragedies, while much of the rest of the world ignored it. This was true long before the rise of ISIS. We recognize that these communities, that your community, is an integral part of a humanistic and enlightened Middle East, if one is to, in fact, exist. And if this community and those communities were to be crushed or expelled, it is not just a disaster for the Middle East or for Christianity in its homeland, but a disaster for humanity in general, as well as for the future prospect of the region. We at MEMRI see ourselves as having a shared mission along with Coptic solidarity and people of goodwill everywhere in protecting and supporting victims of Islamic radicalism. This includes religious and ethnic minorities of every kind, independent and free-thinking Muslims who go against the orthodoxy, or brave and often isolated and persecuted reformers and secularists. MEMRI has done this work long before it became fashionable, when many were looking to soft pedal the extremism of political Islam in groups like Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. We, like you, were speaking the truth about these groups, using their own words and views to expose them. Of course, we do our work principally as a research institute, but we also work actively with authorities throughout the world in protecting human rights and endangered communities, cooperating closely with government, security agencies, and others to identify important trends and patterns in terrorism and jihadism. We also look at threats and rhetoric emerging in the West, not just from mosques, but also from white supremacist, racist, and anti-Semitic, and anti-Christian groups as well, anti-minority Christian groups as well. Sadly to say, the flood of ideological poison and hate is increasing currently. This vigilance on our part is important because the threat is increasing. Many cheered, as we did, when the Islamic State was driven from its territory in recent years. But ISIS still numbers in the thousands in Syria and Iraq, and in pockets from Nigeria to Sinai to Afghanistan, the Philippines, and beyond. And Al-Qaeda as an organization still exists, as do other splinter groups. More problematic, however, than the tens of thousands who are actually waging terrorism and war are the millions who hold that ideology in their hearts. Only last week at MEMRI TV, we highlighted a debate on a Qatari-controlled TV station in London where an academic at Qatar University, a person of Egyptian origin, said that it is forbidden under Sharia for a Muslim to vote for a non-Muslim running for political office. It may seem like a small thing in the context of it all. No one is killing anybody with this language, but it's a building block of a much larger ideological pyramid on which rests ISIS's maximalist and extremist ideology. The toxic building blocks were always there, but for decades now, some Muslim governments and wealthy individuals have lavishly funded the most intolerant and extreme versions of political Islam, and have over time moved the needle toward a more literalist, intolerant, dogmatic, and often violent view of Islam, across a swath of people from Africa, Southeast Asia, and even the Muslim diaspora in the West. This is the poisonous worldview that tells the African Sufi, or syncretistic Muslim with his folk traditions, his saint's tomb, and his sacred tree, that you're not actually a Muslim. This is the petri dish from which the next ISIS or the next Boko Haram will rise. And when a regional government, allied with the U.S. in the fight against ISIS, gives an award to an extremist like Zakir Naik or others, one can see some of the dimension of this problem. Past efforts to address the venom in Saudi or Palestinian or Pakistani school books which helped to poison a generation were worthwhile, but a small part of the deeper issue. The daily venom coming from media calls to incitement from Gulf Arab or Iranian or Turkish or Egyptian media has barely been addressed. What many governments in the West seem to not want to confront is that the struggle with radical Islam is indeed an ideological struggle, and that, despite the terrorist rhetoric about killing crusaders, marching on Rome, and waving the black flag above the White House, it is foremost about power and authority in the region. Historian Jonathan Riley Smith once noted that holy war, whatever the religion involved, has a tendency to turn on the society that bred it. There is indeed an ideological civil war going on for authority in the Middle East that will take years to run its course. The process is painful and indeed often horrific, and it is unclear what the terrible price the region and the rest of us will ultimately bear for its eventual resolution. We know that all too often it is the weakest and most vulnerable communities in the region that pay the highest price, targeted in the streets, in their homes, and in their churches. In this intense and multi-layered ideological struggle for dominance in the Muslim world, the West often seems a clumsy, reluctant, and occasional participant, if not an unwitting bystander. Bland rhetoric and tired declarations promoting unity and tolerance obscure the fact that we are not involved in this ideological struggle, and we need to be. Not loudly, not belligerently, but carefully and creatively. This does not mean America clumsily telling Muslims what they should believe. It should mean encouraging, both directly and indirectly, those voices that are broadly like-minded to our values and aspirations.